Trade, business, communication, and nations rely largely on deep-sea data cables to function. These global links connect the planet's information. But they're very vulnerable. In December 2017, Britain's top military officer, Sir Stuart Peach, warned NATO must safeguard them as a priority due to threats presented by Russia's navy. In international waters, the cables are in a legally gray area, meaning an attack on them may not trigger NATO collective defense, and the cables can be easily destroyed via small explosives, according to the Center for International Maritime Security. If successful, an attack would damage a country's economy and bring their communications network to a halt.
This is a cable landing station in Marseille, France. From the outside, it appears nondescript, but underneath the surface, it connects to a vast data network comprising 95% of the world's overseas internet traffic. As of 2021, the Marseille Fosse facility connects to 16 major undersea cables, serving areas as diverse as Hong Kong, Singapore, India, Oman, Egypt, Greece, Britain, Portugal, Nigeria, and South Africa. Worldwide, there are over 1,400 landing sites like Marseille Fosse, connecting some 500 active and planned cables. In total, the global network spans 1.4 million kilometers, roughly the sun's diameter. And even though the network provides seamless internet traffic across the globe, the supply, installation, and maintenance of these cables are dominated by a handful of companies from the United States, France, Japan, and more recently, China. More than $10 trillion worth of financial transactions are transmitted via these cables every single day. Everything from Netflix programs to YouTube videos, top secret diplomatic cables, and military orders passes through this undersea network. No wonder the cable infrastructure is a geopolitical imperative. Now, China and America are leveraging every instrument of statecraft available to wrest control and set the power parity for the 21st century. From military might to intelligence gathering, economic warfare, and domestic and international law, nothing is off the table. Since 2003, Canberra had occupied the country under the post-9/11 rationale that it was a failed state needing stabilization. Australian security personnel took over policing and other crucial government functions. Warner had previously led that intervention, and with Australia's mission drawing to a close, he now sought to wrap up one final order of business. Upon arrival, Warner met with Solomon's Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare to discuss a new 4,500-kilometer fiber optic cable connecting Honiara to Sydney. The project was seen as a vital development initiative, and it had initially attracted Western support, including backing from the Asian Development Bank. But the plan hit a snag when Sogavare awarded the contract to a Chinese firm, Huawei Marine, provoking anxiety in Canberra. The reason was that in 2013, the Edward Snowden leaks revealed that American hardware, similar to Huawei's, was being rigged to transmit surveillance data to the NSA. Western intelligence agencies were worried Beijing would do the same thing. Soon after meeting with Warner, Sogavare was deposed in a no-confidence vote amid allegations of corruption and bribery. Upon returning to the premiership in 2019, he sought closer security ties with Beijing. But not before his replacement, former World Bank official Rick Howe, dropped Huawei as a contractor, allowing Australia to step in and take control. This incident, mostly forgotten nowadays, was an early shot in a war over the world's data infrastructure. Submarine cables make the world what it is today, but their vulnerability stems from their design. The cables are surprisingly thin, roughly the thickness of a garden hose, and they come in various designs, components, and materials. The most basic anatomy has an outermost layer made of polypropylene plastic yarn for insulation, followed by braided steel wires for protective armor. Further inside is a layer of polyethylene plastic for waterproofing, followed by more steel wires and even more polyethylene plastic. About mid-center through the cable is a copper or aluminum tube that protects the cable from damage and corrosion. This is then followed by a water-blocking tape that wraps around the entirety of the cable. Finally, at the innermost layer are the hair-like optical fibers. These are separated and held in place by a fiberglass core. The optical fibers, meanwhile, fire laser signals to receptors on the other end. However, the signal loses integrity when employed over long distances. So, a repeater device is placed every 60-70 kilometers to boost the signal. Some experts claim repeaters can be rigged for surveillance during manufacturing or maintenance. Others claim the cables can easily be monitored at coastal landing stations, presenting a surveillance goldmine for spy agencies. Moreover, submarine cables are laid by special-purpose vehicles. There are around 50 ships worldwide that are capable of laying and maintaining submarine cables. Ergo, the cable business is one of tremendous niche. Sometimes the available expertise is so sparse that governments will turn to rival powers to repair their infrastructure. This applies to medium-sized powers as well as geopolitical juggernauts. Chinese engineers have worked on cables owned by American firms and vice versa. So, there is always some risk when outsourcing maintenance to others. Devices can be installed to capture or corrupt data, which would turn the cable into a liability. The upshot is that every new cable is a geopolitical gambit. New connections forge and strengthen security ties. Exclusion cuts a state out of the loop. For better or worse, this is how data is transmitted across the globe and why submarine cables are worth fighting for. Satellites, by contrast, carry far less data and are much more expensive to launch and maintain. While the tech may mature in the future, as of 2023, satellites account for a tiny fraction of intercontinental data and will likely stay that way in the coming decades. Nevertheless, there is growing anxiety about the espionage and sabotage vulnerability of submarine cables, which is making governments more protective of their territorial waters. Some nations mandate that only certain companies can lay and maintain submarine cables within their exclusive economic zones. But the stakes weren't always so high. In earlier times, data cables were often financed by state enterprises. In the 2000s, circumstances began to change. Chinese telecom companies like Huawei expanded into underserved markets like Papua New Guinea and the Caribbean. A decade later, Chinese telecoms champions carved out their own niche in the cable business. By 2015, China launched the Digital Silk Road to expand its network, partnering with Huawei Marine. In just 4 years, it had captured 15% of the global market. For America, this was a wake-up call. The Trump administration escalated its rhetoric against Beijing. Submarine cables, by their nature, erase the public-private distinction. This then makes the industry a target for both national security and economic protection. Washington not only tightened its grip on the cable network, but also aimed to ensure American firms dominated the market. This is because once in place, cable operators can collect toll booth charges by selling bandwidth or leasing capacity to tech companies, ISPs, and other firms, often for several decades at a time. Cables connecting to developing countries can also crack open new markets, increasing the reach of American tech giants along with the American state's surveillance capabilities. For this reason, government and business act in concert. The former often takes on the high startup costs to ensure cable contracts go to American firms, not their competitors. By teaming up with the federal government, Silicon Valley behemoths muscled in on the cable business. Since 2016, Google, Meta, and Microsoft have invested $2 billion in cables, 15% of the global total, with another $4 billion projected over the next 3 years. These companies also account for 2/3 of global bandwidth use. So, by controlling their own infrastructure, big tech firms also enhance their hold on the industry. As a result, Chinese cable suppliers saw contract offers dry up. Washington's threat of sanctions prompted both Global Marine and Huawei to sell their stakes in their joint venture to Hengtong Group, who rebranded it HMN Tech. The damage, however, had largely been done. Nowadays, HMN Tech has only 2 projects in development, both limited to Southeast Asia and set to come online by 2025. American policymaking thus succeeded in preventing the Chinese from becoming a major stakeholder in the global submarine cable market, at least so far. HMN Tech accounts for only 10% of known existing and planned cable networks. That is substantially lower than that of French manufacturer ASN and American supplier Subcom, which account for 41% and 21% of the global cable market, respectively. But while America dominates the cable planning phase, China, it seems, is more prominent in the maintenance business. Outages, by definition, are unplanned. Repair work often falls into the lap of whomever is capable, available, and nearby. For this reason, to keep a foothold in submarine cable operations, China has hedged its bet in the maintenance business, tending to the dense cable infrastructure in its nearby seas, including American and Japanese lines. Some analysts claim that this provides opportunities for tapping. In 2022, Chinese ships repaired cables operated by AT&T, Verizon, and Microsoft in the East China Sea. The following May, Microsoft alleged with moderate confidence that state-backed actors hacked into its telecoms infrastructure. Beijing denied any link to the hackers. Partly for this reason, Washington has sought to keep new cables physically distant from China. The Clean Network Initiative, founded in 2020, effectively prohibits direct connections between America and the Chinese mainland. The results speak for themselves. The Bifrost and Echo submarine cables, scheduled to open in 2024, bypass disputed waters near China, as does the Apricot cable, a 12,000-kilometer project connecting to the Philippines and Indonesia, due for completion in 2025. In the Southwest Pacific, however, geopolitical factors are even more pronounced. In 2021, the World Bank scrapped a cable project connecting Guam to Micronesia, Kiribati, and Nauru, which Chinese HMN Tech was favored to win. Washington had essentially scuppered the project. In 2020, the State Department contacted Micronesia, expressing disapproval of Chinese involvement. Thereafter, Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra announced they were funding a new cable along the same route. By June 2023, the $95 million, 2,250-kilometer project was underway. In turn, this enhanced the status of Guam, a highly militarized overseas U.S. territory, as a major data hub. Hostility between America and China pushes companies to forge new routes along which to send data traffic. As national security and data security are prioritized, policy and regulatory frameworks are put in place that fully exclude hostile vendors from the entire ICT ecosystem. Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the U.S. island territory of Guam are now emerging as a hub for international data traffic. But competition also extends into the Indian Ocean. Here, a major friction point has been the CME 6 cable running from Singapore to Paris. Initially, Chinese HMN Tech was favored to build it. The company's bid was by far the most competitive. At $500 million, it was only one-third of the asking price, and the project was expected to raise HMN Tech's international prestige. Once more, though, Washington stepped in and implied to slap sanctions on the project. Predictably, this resulted in an about-face. The project was handed to Subcom, a New Jersey firm with deep links to U.S. intelligence. Subcom itself started life in 1955 as a Cold War project to enhance American anti-submarine capabilities. Nowadays, it develops cables for companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta platforms. Strategically, though, its most important role is as the exclusive contractor for the US military, which it assists in monitoring the PLA Navy. Subcom is also in pole position to lay a new cable to Diego Garcia. The British-administered atoll hosts a 3,000-strong Anglo-American naval base. Its central location allows Washington to project power over vital sea lanes connecting West Asian oil producers with East Asian oil importers. Nowadays, the island serves not just as a naval base, but as a data nexus for the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, which connects the intelligence agencies of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Beijing's activity, on the other hand, is more modest. Chinese investment in the Indian Ocean mostly pertains to cables predating the crackdown on its technology firms. China Mobile was instrumental in bringing about the Two Africa cable, a line connecting Africa to Europe. Meanwhile, China Unicom was a key investor in the Sail cable, a 5,800-kilometer cable connecting Brazil with Cameroon, which went live in 2020. Nevertheless, few Chinese-based submarine cables have reached the West in recent years. One rare exception is the Peace Cable. Going live in December 2022, the 12,000-kilometer line connects Singapore, Kenya, and Pakistan to France, crossing through Egypt and Malta. The cable was entirely financed and built by Chinese companies, including HMN Tech. France gave the project the go-ahead because it wanted to create strategic autonomy for itself at a time of increased hostility between America and China. What makes conflict over subsea cables especially dangerous is the fact it is nearly impossible to distinguish between accident and willful interference. Worse, geopolitical hotspots like the South China Sea are commercial hubs with dense undersea infrastructures. Anchors and fishing nets regularly cause outages, as do natural phenomena like landslides and earthquakes. All this leaves ample scope for misunderstanding and miscalculation. In early 2023, for instance, residents of the Taipei-administered Matsu Islands experienced an internet outage. Within a week, the two main cables connecting the islands to Taiwan were cut. Residents suspected Beijing, but they soon acknowledged that there was no direct evidence of Chinese involvement, much less intent. One of the problems with submarine cables is that international law concerning the infrastructure is underdeveloped and somewhat outdated. The United States and China have tried to fill the gaps with their own regulations. However, both their efforts have been lacking, albeit for different reasons. American laws are too old. The most recent American statute covering subsea cables is the Submarine Cable Act of 1888. Breaking a cable attracts a $5,000 fine and up to 2 years imprisonment. Meanwhile, negligently dropping anchors or fishing nets leads to a $500 fine and 3 months confinement. Scant deterrence for an act that generates repair bills of up to $3 million. Chinese law, meanwhile, is inconsistently enforced. Beijing imposes penalties based on the degree of interference. Intentional or negligent cable damage brings a $1,400 fine, but operators can also be ordered to cease activity. Laying unauthorized cables also attracts a $28,000 fine. But lax enforcement means China averages 26 annual cable defects, the most of any state. This has precipitated a recent crackdown on activities like sand mining, drilling, anchoring, and bottom trawling. Ships suspected of breaking military cables have also been seized. China insists that the right to delineate cable routes across continental shelves rests with the coastal state. In practice, this means notifying the State Oceanic Administration and obtaining a letter of non-objection from the PLA Navy, sometimes resulting in rerouting. Only then can an operator apply for permission to land their cables on Chinese territory. Thereafter, they must keep maritime authorities fully informed of their activities. Yet, this stance will likely cause friction, especially since Beijing argues that operators working within the 9-dash line, a purportedly historical claim to nearly the entire South China Sea, must seek its consent. Both Beijing and Taipei claim Chinese sovereignty over the sea, notwithstanding a 2016 judgment at the Permanent Court of Arbitration finding it unlawful. Washington's permitting process is likewise complex. Operators seeking to work stateside must get permission from the FCC, the Committee for the Assessment of Foreign Participation in the United States, the Army Corps of Engineers, and possibly state and local authorities. This red tape can delay approval by 2 years, a time span that will only increase if a new bill restricting American cable technology sharing becomes regulation. Laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them being made. By issuing strict permitting requirements, both Beijing and Washington run afoul of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And while China has ratified the convention and the US observes it as customary international law, both nations' permitting requirements contravene the law of the sea. Article 79, for instance, clearly states that all nations have the right to lay submarine cables on the continental shelf. Article 112 goes even further and includes the high seas beyond the continental shelf. That said, there are genuine shortfalls in the law of the sea framework. Protections for submarine cables are lacking. The convention does not criminalize attacks on cables in international waters, nor does it oblige states to protect cables in their territorial seas. If these concerns are not addressed universally, each state will address them individually. That is a recipe for conflict. Submarine cables are the world's information pipelines, and as such, they are becoming a major front in the new Cold War between China and America. Infrastructures laid today are consolidating the power blocks of tomorrow with implications for commerce, strategic policy, and international law. While the West retains the lead for now, China's growing stature and the rise of South-South cooperation via BRICS and other fora could open up new axes of collaboration. Whatever happens, promoting and protecting cable projects is now a geopolitical imperative. Because while control of resources has long been a flashpoint for war, nowadays the focal point of conflict is the most precious resource of all: information.
In June, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said that Russia could destroy the undersea cables connecting Europe and the US to the internet in retaliation for the West's alleged involvement in blowing up the Nord Stream gas pipelines last year. There are almost 400 undersea cables laid out across the ocean floor, enabling the real-time global transmission of data and communication signals, and half could be designated critical, carrying 95% of internet traffic. Recently, Russian ghost ships, vessels that have turned off their automatic identification system, have been mapping critical infrastructure sites in the Baltic Sea. An attack could suspend access to phone calls and messages. Health and emergency services would lose contact with the public, making them unable to respond to calls. ATMs would be down. Workplaces and businesses that rely on the internet would also go down. E-commerce would take a hit too, exacerbating disruptions to supply chains and shortages of essential goods. Brick-and-mortar stores would be cut off from communication with suppliers, limiting access to essential supplies. Fixing the damaged cables would take some time, testing the social order of countries as public frustration mounted while essential services continued to be unmet. But it is not just vulnerability to attacks. Recent revelations confirm that the US government, aided by companies like AT&T, conducts surveillance on submarine cables, processing data at a facility called Pinecone in New Jersey. Similar covert buildings across the country serve as hubs for cable espionage, disguising themselves as regular structures to avoid attention in cities like New York and San Francisco. These undersea cables, carrying vast amounts of data, are monitored by government agencies, despite the seeming impossibility of such extensive surveillance. In 1858, a copper cable was laid under the Atlantic Ocean to connect Ireland and Canada. The first message sent through it took 18 hours to reach its destination, which was considered very fast at the time. Even though the cable broke just 3 weeks later, it was a big step forward for a world that wanted to be more connected. Undersea cables have revolutionized global connectivity, allowing us to access information from distant servers. There are approximately 1.5 kilometers of these cables capable of transmitting data at speeds of up to 250 terabytes per second. Data traffic through these cables doubles every 2 to 3 years. An entire industry is dedicated to installing, monitoring, and repairing these cables, which can be damaged by fishing boats, anchors, natural disasters, or even encounters with sharks. Deliberate cable cuts have occurred, including near an island close to China, raising suspicions of intentional interference, although China denies involvement. Sometimes it's clear who's behind cable cuts, like when the United States did it during the conflict with Saddam Hussein in the 1990s. But beyond just cutting cables, powerful nations can use these connections in more subtle ways to control information and communications. Access to submarine cables, a capability held by governments and militaries, enables a technique known as cable tapping. This involves carefully removing a cable's insulation, splicing in another cable, and duplicating the signal to intercept and listen to adversary communications. During World War I, the British Navy used this tactic on a German submarine cable in the Atlantic, decoding messages despite German efforts to use complex codes. World War II saw an expansion of cable tapping due to a more interconnected world, with the United States establishing an agency to monitor civilian telegrams and phone calls via postal and submarine cables. Mass surveillance was deemed necessary for national security during the global conflict. The agency was disbanded after the war, but laid the groundwork for mass surveillance practices. President Harry Truman established the National Security Agency, or NSA, to secretly gather and analyze communications within the United States, justifying these actions by national security concerns. During the Cold War, espionage became even more critical, and underwater cables were targeted. Through tapping into the Soviet cable, the Americans gained insights into the Soviets' apprehension about the nuclear arms race. However, as the new millennium dawned, the world entered the highly interconnected age of the internet. In response to the evolving threat landscape, new surveillance laws were enacted, such as the USA Patriot Act of 2001, allowing for monitoring of various communication methods used by terrorists, including email, the internet, and cell phones. In 2013, Edward Snowden, an NSA contractor, triggered one of the largest leaks in American history. The extent of the breach in American secrets is unprecedented in the nation's history. When we delved into these documents, we discovered a staggering revelation. It wasn't just a single cable in San Francisco being tapped. The NSA had its sights on every cable touching the United States, encompassing an enormous amount of global traffic, including emails, text messages, and phone calls. Their efforts were made possible through cooperation with various telecommunication and tech companies such as Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, and even Apple by 2012. Their overarching goal, according to the leaked documents, was to sniff it all, know it all, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all, partner it all. In other words, as another leaked slide phrased it, they aim to master the internet. A spreadsheet among the leaked documents provides a list of the cables the NSA had access to. We have data for all these cables, which enables us to map them out, from the Southern Cross cable connecting California to Australia to the Apollo cable linking New York to France, and even the small cables connecting Puerto Rico to the British Virgin Islands. By 2009, the NSA had inserted probes into hundreds of submarine cables worldwide. Additionally, the British intelligence agency, GCHQ, was a significant partner, given their long history of expertise in cable tapping. There's an interesting legal loophole at play here. The U.S. law allows the NSA to track individuals outside the United States, but there are restrictions concerning tracking American citizens. To circumvent this, they collaborated with their British counterparts, the GCHQ. Over a couple of years in the early 2010s, the NSA secretly paid £100 million to access vast amounts of data, which they considered a goldmine for exploitation. This data included hundreds of thousands of names, locations, and 194 million messages collected per day. Unlike the NSA, the British could actively spy on American targets, but the core objective was to amass all this information. Now you might wonder, what can you do with 600 million phone events worth of data? It's far too much for any human to manage, and this is where it gets intriguing. The answer lies in a complex flowchart depicted in a slide, which may look mundane but provides insight into their data handling process. The NSA gathers all communication data from cables and phone companies and funnels it through a central processing facility called Pinecone. Presumably, this is where they process much of the data and seek patterns. The NSA's stated purpose is to identify suspected terrorists or individuals posing a threat to national security. To achieve this, they employ computers and algorithms to establish connections between suspected terrorists and their immediate network, including the people they contact and their locations. They assert that they only retain these records and discard everything else. While most cables used to pass through the United States, the leak prompted countries to seek alternative routes, bypassing the US. An example of this is a cable connecting Brazil to South Africa and then on to Asia. Over the past decade, the US has seen a decline in its centrality as the hub of cable connections. This vacuum has opened doors for another player, China. China is swiftly expanding its global cable network through state-owned companies like Huawei. This development adds another dimension to the growing Cold War-like tensions between global powers striving to lead the global system. It turns out that in 2023, controlling and spying on cables is a necessity for global leadership. The consequence of these dynamics is that the global cable map is undergoing a transformation. Previously, a single set of cables connected countries, but now we see duplicates. The Chinese and American lines are each establishing their own networks without connecting to each other. This situation symbolizes the mounting tensions between these two superpowers, heralding the bifurcated world we are entering. China is laying cables to remote islands, providing faster internet to their residents, even if it comes from China and may be tapped. In Africa, both the US and China are setting up competing cables, leaving the countries caught in the middle grappling with the implications of two aspiring hegemons vying for power, each pursuing information gathering in its unique manner. Nonetheless, it's deemed worthwhile because it translates into faster internet and connectivity with the world. Russia is also attempting to join this domain with its aptly named Polar Express cable. Although tapping into cables in the middle of the ocean to spy on your neighbors is somewhat outdated, there's some evidence that Russia might still be doing this. Their ship, the Yantar, a surface vessel widely considered a spy vessel, has been observed above known submarine cable locations near Ireland or Syria. Meanwhile, the private companies overseeing these cables are fortifying their defenses. They're taking additional precautions such as deploying submarine drones that continuously trace the ocean floor, ensuring cables remain undamaged and untampered. Nations are striving to establish separate systems both economically and militarily, along with internet infrastructure. These countries, particularly great powers, are building their own infrastructure to facilitate communication and information control as they are increasingly wary of the other half of the world handling their data. In the end, most of us simply desire fast internet access, the ability to connect with friends worldwide, and a sense of security.